The letter gave me 10 days to remove the wheelchair ramp my son used every single day. According to the HOA, it violated the architectural standards of Oak Ridge Estates and had to be removed immediately. I read the letter 3 times because I honestly thought it had been sent to the wrong house. It hadn't. 2 weeks earlier, we had finally moved into the first home my 11-year-old son Ethan could enter without anyone lifting his wheelchair. He was born with a mobility disability. For the first time in his life, he could roll through our own front door by himself. That ramp wasn't an upgrade. It wasn't a luxury. It was the reason we bought the house. The strange part wasn't the removal order. The strange part was that the HOA had already approved the ramp before we signed the closing papers. I still had the approval letter. Same address, same plans, same measurements, same signature. I called the HOA office, expecting someone to tell me a mistake had been made. Instead, the property manager calmly said the board had reconsidered the approval and expected the ramp to be removed within 10 days. No explanation, no apology, just a deadline. That was the moment I realized I wasn't dealing with a clerical error. Someone had made a deliberate decision. What I didn't know yet was that everyone, including the board, was arguing about the wrong thing. We did not buy the house in Oak Ridge Estates because it was the biggest house we saw. It was not the newest, it was not the cheapest. We bought it because of the front entrance. That was the part Juan kept coming back to. The porch was wide, the yard was flat, the driveway had enough room for the van. The front steps were low enough that a ramp could be built, without making the house look changed or damaged. For most buyers, those details probably meant nothing. For me, they meant everything. My son Ethan was 11 years old then. He had been born with a condition that affected the muscles in his legs, and he had used a wheelchair for as long as I could remember. That was normal life for us. It did not make him fragile. It did not make him helpless. It just meant every building had to be measured before we entered it. Every sidewalk mattered. Every curb mattered. Every doorway mattered. And every home we looked at had some problem I could not solve. One had a steep front walk. One had a narrow hallway. One had a garage entry with 3 sharp steps. For years, we lived in an apartment that was supposed to be temporary. The door was heavy, the sidewalk cracked, the parking spaces were too far. When it rained, water collected near the curb cut, and I would have to guide Ethan around it while carrying groceries in one hand and his backpack in the other. He never complained much. That almost made it harder. By the time I started looking for a house, I was not looking for perfect. I was looking for possible. Oak Ridge Estates seemed possible. The neighborhood sat in a quiet part of suburban Virginia, with mature trees, clean sidewalks, and houses that all looked cared for. It looked safe, orderly, predictable. At that point in my life, predictable sounded good. The realtor told me there was an HOA. I asked about exterior modifications before I even asked about the appliances. She told me Oak Ridge Estates had an architectural review committee, but that accessibility modifications were usually handled without issue, as long as the plans were submitted before work began. Usually. That word stayed with me. I had been through enough systems to know that people were often kind when speaking generally, and much less kind once paperwork was involved. So we did the paperwork. Before I made the final offer, I sent the ramp plans to the HOA. The drawings showed the front entrance, they showed the slope, they showed the white railings. I remember looking at the plans on my kitchen table, tracing the ramp with my finger like I was trying to prove to myself that it was real. It would connect to the porch and follow the side of the front lawn in a way that looked intentional. I wanted to do it right. The realtor called me 4 days later. The architectural committee had approved it, in writing. I read the email twice, then printed it and put it in a folder with the inspection report, the loan documents, and every other paper that felt too important to trust to a computer. That should have been enough. At least, I thought it was. The closing happened on a Thursday morning. I remember sitting in the parking lot afterward with the keys in my hand, not crying exactly, but not able to start the car for a minute. I had bought space. I had bought paint. Mostly, I had bought a front door my son could use. The ramp was built the following week. On move-in day, the house was still half empty. Ethan waited in the driveway while I opened the front door. He rolled toward the ramp slowly at first. Then he stopped near the bottom. For a second, he just looked at it. Then he pushed forward, up the ramp, across the porch, through the front door. No one lifted him. He went into his own house by himself. That was the moment the house became worth everything it had cost. The mortgage, the inspections, the sleepless nights, all of it. For the next 2 weeks, Oak Ridge Estates felt like the right decision. Neighbors waved. Ethan learned the angle of the driveway and the turn into the front hall. Every morning, he left for school without me having to stand behind his chair. Every afternoon, he came back through the front door on his own. The ramp became part of the house almost immediately. That was what made the letter so hard to understand when it arrived. It came in a white envelope with the Oak Ridge Estates HOA return address in the corner. I opened it standing in the kitchen. The first line said, "The front entry ramp was not consistent with the architectural standards of the community." The second line said, it had to be removed within 10 days. I stood there for a long time, reading the same sentences over and over. Then I went to the folder. I pulled out the approval letter. Same house, same plans, same ramp, same HOA. 2 weeks earlier, Oak Ridge Estates had approved the structure my son needed to enter our home. Now they were ordering me to remove it. And the only question I could not answer was the one that would follow me through everything that happened next. Why would they approve it before we bought the house, then try to take it away after we moved in? The first thing I did was put both letters on the kitchen table. The approval letter went on the left. The removal notice went on the right. I stared at them for several minutes, trying to make them belong to the same story. They had the same HOA name at the top, the same address, the same property management company, the same neighborhood. But they said opposite things. One said the front entry modification had been approved. The other said the same front entry modification had to be removed within 10 days. At first, I kept looking for some small difference, a wrong lot number, a typo in the address, something that would let me call the office and explain that their system had mixed up 2 houses. But everything matched. That was what made it worse. I called the Oak Ridge Estates office just after 9 the next morning. A woman answered on the second ring. She did not sound surprised. When I gave her my address, there was a pause, just long enough for me to notice it. Then she said she would transfer me to the property manager. She did not ask what the issue was. She already knew where the call needed to go. That was the first small thing that bothered me. Not enough to call it suspicious, just enough to stay in my mind. The property manager's name was Marlene Frost. I had seen her name at the bottom of the approval letter. I had also seen it at the bottom of the removal notice. Marlene came on the line with the same calm tone people use when they are reading from a file. I told her I had received a removal notice for the ramp. I told her the ramp had already been approved. I told her it had been built exactly according to the approved plans. There was another pause. Then she said the board had reconsidered the approval. That was the word she used. Reconsidered. Not corrected, not clarified, not reviewed. Reconsidered. I asked what that meant. She said the board had determined the ramp was not consistent with the architectural standards of Oak Ridge Estates. I looked across the kitchen at the folder where I kept the approval letter. For a moment, I thought maybe I had misunderstood the entire process. Maybe in an HOA, approved only meant approved until someone changed their mind. I asked if the board had seen the original plans. She said yes. I asked if the ramp had been built differently. She said that was not the issue. I asked what the issue was. She repeated that the board had reconsidered. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody said anything cruel. That almost made it harder to understand. If someone had yelled, I could have called it hostility. But Marlene sounded like a person explaining a normal office procedure. Before we hung up, she told me I could request to be placed on the agenda for the next board meeting. It was the following Tuesday. The removal deadline would still be running. I asked if the deadline could be paused. She said the notice remained active. After I hung up, I sat at the table and wrote down the word reconsidered. I do that when something feels important, and I do not yet know why. For the next few days, I kept waiting for another call. Then, on Friday afternoon, a second envelope arrived. It was not a fine. Not yet. It was a reminder. The letter said the property remained out of compliance and that failure to remove the front entry structure by the original deadline could result in enforcement action. Front entry structure. Not wheelchair ramp. Not accessibility ramp. Not modification for my son. Front entry structure. The words felt chosen, careful, clean, as if someone had scrubbed the human part out of the sentence. That weekend, Ethan asked why I kept looking through the house folder. I told him there was a question about the ramp paperwork. That was all. I could not say that out loud yet. On Tuesday, I went to the board meeting. I arrived early. 3 board members sat at the table. The president was a man named Charles Whitaker. He looked exactly like the kind of person who would read every rule twice before signing anything. Beside him sat Marlene Frost, the property manager, with a laptop open. At the end of the table was the board secretary, a woman named Diane Cole, already taking notes before anyone had said anything important. That was the second thing I noticed. They were not there to have a conversation. They were there to make a record. When my name was called, I walked to the front and placed the approval letter on the table. I explained that the ramp had been submitted before closing. I explained that it had been approved in writing. I explained that the contractor had followed the plans exactly. Charles Whitaker picked up the approval letter. He looked at it for only a few seconds. Then he slid it back across the table. He did not ask to see the plans. He did not ask about the slope. He did not ask who used the ramp. He said the board had reconsidered the exterior modification after reviewing its visual impact on the community. The sentence sounded prepared, not rehearsed like a performance, prepared like policy. I waited for someone to mention Ethan. No one did. I waited for someone to ask why the ramp had been requested. No one did. Marlene looked at her screen. Diane typed. The other board members looked down at their packets. For a few seconds, I had the strange feeling that everyone in the room knew which words were allowed and which words were not. Ramp was allowed. Structure was allowed. Standards was allowed. Appearance was allowed. Ethan was not. Disability was not. Access was not. I asked how an approval could be reconsidered after the house had been purchased and the ramp had been built. Charles folded his hands on the table. He said the association had an obligation to enforce the governing documents consistently. That was the first time I heard the phrase, consistent enforcement. He said exceptions could create precedent. He said precedent could weaken architectural standards. He sounded completely certain. That certainty unsettled me more than anger would have, because anger burns out. Certainty builds procedures. I told him the ramp was the reason I had bought the house. I told him the approval had been included in my closing file. For the first time, Marlene looked up from her laptop. She said the approval had been issued based on the information submitted at the time. I asked what information had changed. No one answered immediately. Charles said the board had the right to review exterior modifications for compliance. That was not an answer. It was a circle. I had brought a document. They had brought phrases. The meeting moved on after less than 10 minutes. No one said they would look into it. No one said they would suspend the deadline. I walked back to my car with the same approval letter I had carried in, except now it felt lighter somehow, less protective. 3 days later, the first fine arrived. $100. Small enough to look reasonable, large enough to make the decision real. The letter said the property remained in violation due to failure to remove the unauthorized front entry structure. Unauthorized. I read that word twice. Then I pulled out the original approval again. The ramp had gone from approved to reconsidered to unauthorized, without changing at all. Same wood, same railings, same house. The only thing that had changed was the way the board described it. That was when I stopped thinking this was an administrative mistake. Mistakes leave room for correction. This felt like someone had already decided what the ramp was supposed to be, and once they gave it that name, every letter after that treated the decision as if it had always been true. By the end of that week, I no longer wondered whether the board was confused. They were not confused. They were calm, organized, prepared, and completely convinced they had the authority to do exactly what they were doing. What I still did not know was who had convinced them of that. After the board meeting, I stopped asking people what they thought. I started asking what they knew. The first thing I did was spread every HOA document across my kitchen table. The CC&Rs, the architectural guidelines, the approval letter, the removal notice, the first fine. I thought I had missed something obvious, some sentence that explained why everyone on the board sounded so certain. Instead, I found the same phrases over and over. Uniform appearance, community standards, architectural harmony. I kept reading until midnight. Then I realized something strange. The rules talked for pages about fences, paint colors, decks, roofs, even mailboxes. But they never mentioned wheelchair ramps. I read that section 3 times. If the rules never mentioned ramps, why did everyone keep telling me the rules were clear? The next morning, I called the realtor. She still remembered the house. She remembered the approval, too. When I asked if we had missed something before closing, she immediately pulled up my file. A few seconds later, she said something that caught my attention. The approval was included with your closing documents. She sounded almost confused that I was asking. That answer should have reassured me. Instead, it created another question. If the approval had been strong enough for the sale, why wasn't it strong enough 2 weeks later? Before we ended the call, she gave me the name of someone who had once served on the board, Martin Bell. He had moved away, but she said if anyone understood how architectural requests were handled, it was him. I called that afternoon. I expected him to defend the board. He didn't. I expected him to criticize them. He didn't do that either. He asked me one question. What exactly was the ramp called on the application? I looked at the papers in front of me. I don't know. He told me to find out before I spent another minute reading the rules. Then he wished me luck and hung up. That conversation lasted less than 3 minutes, but it completely changed what I was looking for. Until then, I had been reading the rules. Now, I was reading my own paperwork. I pulled out the original application. My address, the contractor, the drawings, the measurements. Everything looked normal. Then I reached the description box. I stopped. The ramp wasn't described as a wheelchair ramp. It wasn't described as an accessibility modification. It wasn't even described as something medically necessary. It had been entered as an exterior improvement. I looked back at the removal notice, front entry structure. Then the approval letter, front entry modification. 3 documents, 3 different descriptions. Not one of them mentioned Ethan. I sat there staring at those pages much longer than I should have, because suddenly, the board meeting started making more sense. Not because I agreed with them. Because I could finally see what they were looking at. They weren't looking at my son. They were looking at a file. And inside that file, the ramp looked exactly like any other project. Later that afternoon, Ethan came home from school. He rolled up the ramp without slowing down, dropped his backpack by the door, asked what was for dinner. The entire trip from the driveway to the kitchen took less than 20 seconds. 20 seconds. That was the thing everyone seemed to be arguing about. Not the wood, not the railings, 20 seconds of independence. I picked up the phone one more time and called Marlene Frost. I asked a very simple question. Who decides how an application is classified? There was a pause. Long. Longer than usual. Then she answered. The homeowner completes the application. It sounded reasonable until I remembered something. The realtor had submitted the paperwork before closing. I hadn't filled out the original application myself. Someone else had. For the first time, I wasn't wondering whether the board had misread the rules. I was wondering whether the file had been placed in the wrong category before it ever reached the board. Because if that happened, everything that followed suddenly made a lot more sense. And I still didn't know who had made that decision. 3 days after the first fine arrived, another envelope appeared in my mailbox. For a moment, I thought it was another violation notice. Instead, it was a mediation request. The board had agreed to meet. I read the letter twice. For the first time, someone outside Oak Ridge Estates would finally hear both sides. I wasn't expecting anyone to take my side. I was hoping someone would simply look at the paperwork. The night before the meeting, I spread every document across the dining room table. The approval, the application, the contractor's drawings, the violation notice, the fine. I counted them twice. Then I noticed one page was missing. Panic took over. I emptied the entire folder onto the table before realizing the missing page was still sitting in the printer. I laughed. It was the first time I'd laughed in weeks. The next morning, Ethan asked why I was leaving so early. I have a meeting, I told him. He didn't ask another question. I was grateful for that. The mediation office was in a small business park, 20 minutes away. Inside, the receptionist handed me a temporary badge. Conference room B, she said. I followed the hallway to a small waiting area. The chairs were hard plastic. A coffee machine hummed quietly in the corner. I set my folder on my lap and never let go of it. A few minutes later, Marlene Frost walked in, carrying 2 thick binders. She smiled politely. Charles Whitaker arrived just behind her. He carried a single folder. The conference room was small. 1 table, 5 chairs, a pitcher of water, yellow legal pads placed neatly in front of every seat. Then the mediator walked in, Daniel Mercer. He introduced himself, shook everyone's hand, and sat down. I expected him to ask us to explain what happened. Instead, he looked directly at me. The original application, please. I slid it across the table. He opened it immediately. Nobody spoke. The only sound in the room was paper turning. Daniel read slowly. He reached the last page. Then he went back to the beginning and started again. He looked up. Who completed this application? Before Charles could answer, Marlene spoke. It was submitted before closing by the buyer's realtor. Daniel nodded. He wrote 4 or 5 words on his legal pad. Then he asked, did the contractor build the ramp exactly as approved? Yes, I answered. He looked at Marlene. She nodded. Yes. Another note. Another page. No reaction. No opinion. Just questions. A minute later, Daniel reached for the contractor's drawings. He placed them beside the application. I found myself watching his pen instead of his face. Every few moments, he underlined something, then stopped. Whatever he was looking for, he hadn't found it yet. Or maybe he had. I couldn't tell. Then came another question. Was any medical documentation requested before the approval? Charles answered, no. Daniel looked back at the application. Was any requested after construction? Again, no. He underlined another line. The room became strangely quiet. Even the coffee machine outside seemed louder. For nearly an hour, the conversation moved like that. A question, an answer, a note. No arguments, no speeches. Every time I thought Daniel was about to explain something, he simply reached for another page. Near the end of the meeting, he lined up 3 documents: the application, the approval letter, the violation notice. He studied them without speaking. Then he asked the first question that seemed to surprise everyone. Why is the same structure described 3 different ways? Nobody answered immediately. I looked down. He was right. Exterior improvement, front entry modification, unauthorized structure. The ramp had never changed. Only the words had. Charles finally cleared his throat. The board reconsidered the architectural impact. Daniel didn't respond. He circled something on the application. Not the approval, the application. Again, that was the 3rd time he had gone back to it. I realized my coffee had been sitting untouched since the meeting began. It was cold now. Daniel closed the folder. I expected the meeting to end. Instead, he asked one final question. He looked at Marlene. When this application was received, he paused for the first time all morning. Who decided it would go through the architectural review committee? The room stayed silent for several seconds. Finally, Marlene answered. That is our standard process. Daniel nodded once, closed his notebook, and stood up. The mediation ended without an agreement. The board refused to withdraw the violation. I refused to remove the ramp. As everyone gathered their papers, I watched Daniel place every document back into a single stack. Then, just before leaving, he quietly pulled the application back out one last time. He looked at it for only a few seconds, closed the folder, and walked away. The entire morning, he had barely looked at the violation notice. He had barely touched the approval letter, but he kept returning to the application. Walking back to my car, I realized something. Daniel hadn't spent 2 hours trying to decide whether the ramp belonged there. He had spent 2 hours trying to understand how the board had decided what the ramp actually was. And for the first time, I wasn't wondering whether the board had made the wrong decision. I was wondering whether they had started with the wrong file. The morning after the mediation, I couldn't stop thinking about one thing. Not the board, not the fine, not even the argument. I kept thinking about Daniel Mercer reaching back across the table for the application after the meeting was already over. He had looked at it one last time. Then he walked away without saying why. Whatever he had been looking for, I hadn't seen it. After Ethan left for school, I opened my old laptop and searched my email. Oak Ridge, closing, ramp. Nothing. Too many messages appeared. Inspection reports, mortgage paperwork, moving companies, HOA reminders. For a moment, I wondered if I had imagined the email altogether. Then I noticed a subject line I hadn't read in months. Architectural review submission. I clicked it. Before opening the attachments, I read the email itself. It had been written by my realtor a week before closing. She explained that the request involved a wheelchair ramp for my 11-year-old son. She mentioned Ethan by name. She explained why accessibility mattered. I read the message twice. Then I opened the attachments. the application, contractor drawings, material specifications, measurements, photos of the front porch. I opened the drawings first. Daniel had barely looked at them. I zoomed in on every page. The slope, the landing, the handrails. Everything matched the ramp sitting outside my front door. Nothing looked wrong. Just as I reached for the application, my phone buzzed. It was Ethan's school. For one long second, I forgot everything else. The call wasn't an emergency. His teacher only wanted to confirm a schedule change. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, but by the time I hung up, the application was still open on my screen, waiting. I clicked the first page. Address, lot number, contractor, nothing unusual. Then I reached the description. Exterior front entry improvement with railing. I read the sentence again. I looked back at the realtor's email. Wheelchair ramp. Accessibility. Ethan. I looked back at the application. Exterior improvement. One document explained why we needed the ramp. The other only described what it looked like. I leaned back in my chair. For the first time, I understood why Daniel had spent so much time staring at that form. The application wasn't wrong. It just wasn't complete. Someone reading only that page would never know a child depended on the structure every day. I searched the rest of the attachments. No medical explanation. No reference to Ethan. No mention of accessibility. Only dimensions, materials, measurements. The ramp had become a construction project. Its purpose had disappeared. I sent my realtor a short email. Did you write the description on the application? Hours passed. No reply. I tried working around the house. I folded laundry, loaded the dishwasher, walked past the front window more times than I could count. Every time I looked outside, I saw the ramp. It hadn't changed. Only the paperwork had. Late that afternoon, the printer finally stopped humming. I had printed every document from the original submission. I spread them across the dining room table exactly the way Daniel had arranged them. Email, application, drawings, approval, violation notice. One by one, I compared the language. The email talked about Ethan. The application talked about an exterior improvement. The approval mentioned a front entry modification. The violation called it an unauthorized structure. Each document moved one step farther away from the reason the ramp existed. The front door opened. Ethan came home. He dropped his backpack and noticed the drawings on the table. He picked up one of the pages. "That's our ramp!" He smiled. He didn't need labels. He didn't need descriptions. He knew exactly what he was looking at. After dinner, my realtor finally replied. 3 sentences. She had used the HOA's standard application exactly as instructed. She had attached the explanation about Ethan in the submission email. She assumed the board reviewed the entire packet together. Assumed. That word stayed with me. An hour later, I called Marlene Frost. I asked a different question. Did every board member receive the original email from my realtor? Silence. Not long, just long enough to notice. Finally, she answered. The board reviewed the materials provided through the architectural process. That wasn't what I asked. Did they receive the email explaining why the ramp was needed? Another pause. I can't speak to what individual board members reviewed. I ended the call. I looked back at the papers. For days, I had been asking why the board approved the ramp and then changed its mind. Now I was asking something different. What if they had never been looking at the same request my realtor thought she had submitted? The ramp hadn't changed. The drawings hadn't changed. Only the language had. somewhere between the email and the application, the reason for the ramp had quietly disappeared. And if that happened before the file ever reached the board, who was responsible for making sure they understood what they were actually approving? That evening, another board meeting was scheduled. I almost stayed home. I already knew what they were going to say. Then I remembered something Daniel Mercer had done during the mediation. He hadn't listened only to my case. He had watched how the board answered questions. Maybe I needed to do the same. So instead of speaking, I decided to listen. The meeting started with routine business: budget updates, landscaping contracts, pool maintenance. Nothing connected to my ramp. For a few minutes, I wondered if I had wasted my evening. Then the first homeowner stood up. He wanted permission to leave a small utility trailer beside his garage for 2 weeks while his roof was being replaced. Charles listened carefully, looked toward Marlene, and she opened one of her binders. "I'm sorry," he said. "If we make one exception, we'll have difficulty enforcing the rule consistently." The homeowner tried again, but Charles just smiled politely. "I understand, but exceptions create precedent." The conversation ended there. A few minutes later, another resident stepped forward. She wanted permission to repaint her front door a darker shade of blue. Again, Marlene opened the binder. Again, Charles waited. Again, the answer sounded identical. "Once we approve one exception..." He didn't finish the sentence, and the woman nodded before he even did. It was as if she already knew the rest. I stopped taking notes about the homeowners. I started writing down the words the board repeated: consistent, precedent, uniformity, standards. Every discussion eventually found its way back to one of those 4 words. Then something happened I hadn't expected. A man sitting 2 rows ahead of me stood up without being called. He wasn't angry. He just sounded genuinely confused. What if the rule itself doesn't fit the situation? The room became quiet. For the first time that evening, nobody answered immediately. Charles looked toward Marlene. Marlene looked down at her binder. Finally, Charles spoke. "The board's responsibility is to apply the governing documents equally." The man nodded slowly. "I didn't ask about equally," he paused. "I asked about fairly." Nobody answered. Not Charles, not Marlene, not anyone at the table. The secretary simply continued typing. A few seconds later, Charles thanked him for his comments and called the next item on the agenda. The meeting moved on, but I didn't. That single question stayed with me for the rest of the evening. Equal? Fair? Until then, I had been treating those words as if they meant the same thing. Maybe they didn't. After the meeting ended, I waited until most people had left. As I walked toward the parking lot, I heard 2 board members talking behind me. One of them laughed quietly. "We're still dealing with the Johnson deck." The other shook his head. "That's exactly why we can't make another exception." Johnson. I had never heard that name before. By the time I turned around, they were already walking away. Another exception. Another. Not the first. That word followed me all the way home. The next morning, I searched through old community newsletters, meeting summaries, annual reports, and committee announcements. I wasn't looking for my name anymore. I was looking for Johnson. It took almost an hour before I found it. Not a lawsuit, not a newspaper article. Just 3 lines buried in old meeting minutes. Discussion regarding previously approved deck variants. No explanation, no outcome, nothing else. I leaned back in my chair. For weeks, I had believed the board was fighting my ramp. Now I wasn't so sure. Maybe they were fighting something older. Something that had happened before I ever moved into Oak Ridge Estates. That afternoon, another email from the HOA arrived. Nothing dramatic, just another reminder that my violation remained open. At the bottom of the page, the same sentence appeared again. Consistent enforcement. This time, I barely looked at it. Instead, I kept thinking about a deck I'd never seen, a homeowner named Johnson I'd never met, and one sentence I couldn't get out of my head. That's exactly why we can't make another exception. Another. How many exceptions had there been before mine? And what had happened the last time the board decided to make one? The next HOA letter arrived before breakfast. I saw the envelope through the front window before I opened the door. By then, I knew what it was. Same white paper, same return address, same weight in my hand. I carried it inside and set it on the kitchen counter without opening it. That was new. For weeks, every letter had felt urgent. That morning, it felt predictable. Ethan rolled into the kitchen a few minutes later, opened the refrigerator, took out a yogurt, and asked if his blue hoodie was clean. He passed the envelope without looking at it. I told him the hoodie was in the dryer. He nodded and rolled back toward his room. After he left for school, I finally opened the letter. Another fine, another deadline, another paragraph about compliance. I read only the first line, folded it once, and placed it on top of the other notices. The fines were no longer the mystery. The mystery was why every person involved kept asking the same wrong questions. My phone vibrated while I was rinsing my coffee cup. It was Daniel Mercer. His email was only 4 sentences. He thanked me for attending mediation, then said someone else should look at my file before I made another decision. Below that was one name, Rachel Porter. No explanation, no opinion, just the contact. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. Daniel had never wasted words. If he was sending me somewhere, it was because something in my file still mattered. I called Rachel that afternoon. She did not ask for the whole story. She did not ask about the fines. She gave me one instruction: bring everything. The next morning, I emptied the blue folder across the dining room table. Application, approval, realtor emails, contractor drawings, photos, receipts, violation notices, fine letters, meeting notes. Every page I almost left behind went back into the folder. I remembered Daniel turning the application over again and again. I was done deciding which papers were important. Rachel's office was on the second floor of a small brick building near downtown. There was no reception desk, just a narrow hallway, a water fountain, and 4 closed doors. Outside the last door, a man sat with a folder on his knees. Beside him, a woman leaned on a cane. Nobody spoke. When Rachel's door opened, the couple stood slowly. The woman thanked her. Rachel said something too quiet for me to hear, and then they walked toward the elevator. I watched their folder disappear with them. For the first time, I wondered how many people arrived here, carrying paperwork that had already failed them somewhere else. Rachel invited me inside. Her office was plain. 1 desk, 2 chairs, a bookshelf, a printer with a blinking light. Nothing dramatic, nothing that promised answers. She reached for my folder before asking me to sit. That caught my attention. Not my story, not my opinion, the folder. She opened the application first, then the realtor's email, then the application again. The violation notices stayed untouched. The fines stayed in the back. For several minutes, the only sounds were paper, the printer clicking behind her, and traffic outside the window. Rachel placed the application on the left and the realtor's email on the right. Then she switched them, and then she switched them back. She uncapped a yellow marker and underlined 2 words on the application: exterior improvement. She did not explain. She moved the marker aside and picked up the email. That email mentioned Ethan in the first paragraph. It mentioned the wheelchair, and it mentioned access to the home before closing. The application did not. I noticed that before Rachel said anything. And once I saw it, I could not stop seeing it. Rachel stood up and walked to the printer. A page had finished printing. She looked at it, folded it once, and placed it face down beside her legal pad. I did not ask what it was. She did not offer. Then she made a phone call. She stepped into the hallway and pulled the door almost closed. I heard only pieces. Her name, my address, a long pause. Then one sentence. I'm reviewing the submission history. After that, silence. When she came back in, she did not tell me who had answered. She wrote 3 words on her legal pad, turned the pad slightly, not enough for me to read, and then she opened the application again. Rachel studied the application for another minute, then reached for the folded page lying beside her legal pad. She opened it, compared the date, and folded it again. Without saying a word, she slipped it beneath my application. Only the corner remained visible. I leaned forward instinctively, but she noticed. Instead of turning the page toward me, she placed another sheet on top of it. Whatever she had found, she wasn't ready to share. A few seconds later, she stood and walked to the bookshelf. She pulled out a thick binder, opened it halfway, read one page, and closed it again. The entire thing lasted less than 30 seconds, but when she returned to the desk, she looked at my application differently. She didn't look surprised. She looked cautious. Then she picked up the phone. "This is Rachel Porter," she said. A pause. "I'm trying to verify the submission history." Silence. "I understand." Another pause. "Thank you." She ended the call with no expression and no explanation, simply drawing one short line across her legal pad. She watched the application, then the folded page, and finally she looked at me. "After the approval," she asked, "did anyone contact you before sending the violation notice?" I thought back to every letter, every email, every phone call. No. She nodded and slid the application toward me. "Read the first page again." I did. Address, lot number, contractor, description, signature. It was nothing I hadn't read before. Then I looked at the realtor's email beside her. For weeks, I had treated those pages as if they belonged together, but suddenly, they didn't. One explained why we were moving. The other described what was being built. Somewhere between those 2 documents, the reason disappeared. Rachel rested one finger on the application. Everything that followed, she paused, started here. She offered no lecture, no legal opinion, just that one sentence. For the first time since the first HOA letter arrived, I stopped thinking about the board meeting, the fines, or Charles. Instead, I kept staring at a single sheet of paper that had crossed someone's desk months before we even owned the house. Driving home, I never turned on the radio. The blue folder stayed on the passenger seat, and every red light gave me another excuse to look at it. That evening, I spread every document across the dining room table again. But this time, I ignored the measurements, the drawings, and the violation notices. I searched for one name: Ethan. The realtor's email mentioned him immediately, but after that, he disappeared. The approval letter, nothing. The violation notice, nothing. The fine letters, nothing. The board correspondence, nothing. Page after page discussed the ramp, but not one discussed the boy who needed it. The front door opened, and Ethan came home carrying 2 grocery bags balanced across his lap. He rolled up the ramp without slowing down, unlocked the door, and disappeared into the kitchen. He never looked at the railings, never thought about the concrete, never noticed the angle. To him, it wasn't construction, architecture, or an improvement. It was simply the way home. I looked back at the application one last time. The first thing that disappeared from the file wasn't the ramp. It was Ethan. And once I saw that, I couldn't stop wondering what everyone else had failed to see before making a decision that changed our lives. 2 days after meeting Rachel, my phone rang again. It was Daniel Mercer, and he didn't waste time with small talk. He asked if I was available the following Thursday. The board had agreed to another meeting. That surprised me. 2 weeks earlier, they had acted as though the case was already over, but now they wanted another conversation. When I arrived, the room looked exactly the same. The same conference table, the same chairs, the same folders. But the people sitting around it felt different. Charles Whitaker no longer leaned back with folded arms, and Marlene Frost wasn't organizing papers before anyone spoke. Even the other board members avoided looking at one another. It was the first time I had seen uncertainty inside that room. Rachel sat beside me. She hadn't brought a thick binder, only my blue folder. Daniel welcomed everyone, thanked us for returning, and explained that the purpose of the meeting was to review new information that had surfaced after mediation. No one interrupted him. Rachel opened the folder. She didn't begin with the violation notices or the fines. She placed only 3 documents on the table: the realtor's original email, the application, and the approval letter. Nothing else. Daniel looked at the 3 pages for several seconds, then looked toward Charles. "Before we continue," he said quietly, "I'd like to understand one decision." Nobody answered. He rested one hand on the application. "Who classified this request as an exterior architectural improvement?" Silence. Charles looked toward Marlene. Marlene opened her folder, turned one page, then another, and finally stopped. "I believe it entered the architectural review process," she said. Daniel nodded. He didn't argue. He simply looked at Rachel. Rachel slid the application closer to the center of the table. She tapped the words, "exterior improvement." That classification determined everything that followed. Charles frowned. "The ramp still has to comply with community standards." Rachel nodded. Of course. She didn't challenge him, and she didn't raise her voice. She moved the realtor's email beside the application. "This document explains why the family requested the ramp before purchasing the home. The application describes what would be built, but once the request was processed only as an exterior improvement, every review focused on appearance." Nobody spoke. Rachel continued. "A wheelchair ramp can certainly be reviewed for design, materials, and placement, but when the modification is requested because a resident with a disability needs equal access to the home, the review cannot stop there." She let that sentence settle over the room. The question changes. Daniel leaned forward. What should the question have been? Rachel answered without looking away from the file. Whether the requested modification was necessary to provide equal use and enjoyment of the property. The room fell silent again. That was the first time anyone had described the issue that way, not as a ramp, not as an architectural feature, but as access. Charles looked down at the approval letter. "If that's true," he said carefully, "the application should have contained more information." Rachel nodded. "It could have, but no one ever asked for it." I watched Marlene lower her eyes. For weeks, she had answered every question immediately. Now, she didn't speak at all. Daniel picked up the approval letter. "The board approved this request," he said, placing it beside the violation notice. Then, 2 weeks later, ordered it removed. What changed? Nobody answered. Finally, Rachel spoke again. "Nothing changed about the ramp." She touched the approval letter. "The category never changed." Then she touched the violation notice. "But the board kept applying architectural enforcement to a request that should have received a broader review once its purpose was understood." No one argued. No one interrupted. For the first time since this began, Charles didn't defend the decision. Instead, he asked a different question. If the process was incomplete, what happens now? Daniel answered before Rachel could. That depends on whether the association is willing to correct the process voluntarily. The room stayed quiet. No votes, no speeches, no accusations. Just silence. A different kind of silence than the one I had heard during mediation. Back then, they had been certain. Now, they were thinking. As the meeting ended, nobody mentioned the fines, and nobody mentioned removing the ramp. Daniel collected the documents, and Rachel closed the blue folder. Charles remained seated for several seconds after everyone else stood. He looked at the application one last time. Not with frustration, but with doubt. Walking back to my car, I realized something. For 2 months, the board had defended its decision as though the problem was the ramp. Now, they weren't talking about the ramp anymore. They were talking about the process that had led to every decision after it. The structure in front of my house had never really changed, only the way they had chosen to see it. And if the board had finally realized they had been asking the wrong question, what would they do when the rest of Oak Ridge Estates found out? The next letter arrived on a quiet Monday morning. For a moment, I almost left it in the mailbox. After everything that had happened, I had grown tired of seeing the Oak Ridge Estates return address. Eventually, I carried it inside and opened it at the kitchen counter. There was no violation notice, no deadline, no balance due. Every fine against our property had been withdrawn, and the enforcement action was officially closed. I read the letter twice before setting it down. For weeks, I had imagined that moment. But instead of the victory I expected, it felt strangely quiet. There were no cheers, no celebration, just a single sheet of paper, ending months of arguments. 2 days later, Daniel forwarded a copy of the board's meeting minutes. Most of the document was routine. Landscaping, budget items, maintenance. But halfway down the final page, one paragraph caught my attention. Oak Ridge Estates would adopt a separate review procedure for future disability-related modification requests. One paragraph. No apology, no explanation, no mention of our family. Just a new procedure. Sometimes change arrives without anyone admitting why it became necessary. That afternoon, I met Rachel one last time. She handed my blue folder back across the desk. It looked exactly the way I had given it to her weeks earlier. The same scratched cover, the same worn corners, the same stack of papers that had followed me through every meeting. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "I think you'll want to keep this," she finally said. I smiled. "I hope I never have to open it again." She smiled back. "I hope Ethan never has to either." There wasn't much else to say. We shook hands, and I carried the folder back to my car. For the first time, it felt like nothing more than paper. Later that week, another email appeared in my inbox. Beginning the following month, the association would be assigned a new property manager. Marlene's name wasn't mentioned again. No announcement, no farewell. She simply disappeared from future correspondence. Life slowly returned to normal. The board stopped sending letters, neighbors stopped asking questions, and the conversations around Oak Ridge Estates drifted back to gardens, school schedules, vacations, and weekend barbecues. For the first time in months, nobody seemed interested in the house with the ramp. One afternoon, I walked to the mailbox and found nothing except grocery coupons and an electricity bill. I stood there smiling longer than I probably should have. Ordinary mail had never looked so good. A few weeks later, the annual board election notice arrived. I glanced through the list of candidates, but Charles Whitaker's name wasn't there. Whether he chose to step away or simply wasn't returning, I never found out. By then, it didn't matter. A few days later, I walked past the community bulletin board near the clubhouse. Summer picnic, pool hours, yard waste collection, movie night for the kids. That was all. For months, every notice around the neighborhood had reminded me of meetings, deadlines, and violations. Now, the board was just a board again. Pieces of paper pinned to cork. Nothing more. It was amazing how quickly ordinary life returned once people stopped looking for someone to blame. Summer settled over Oak Ridge Estates. The flowers around our porch bloomed, and children rode their bikes through the neighborhood again. The arguments were over. One afternoon, just after 3, I heard the school bus stop outside. From the kitchen window, I watched Ethan roll down the sidewalk with his backpack resting across his lap. He turned toward the driveway without slowing down, rolled up the ramp, across the porch, and unlocked the front door. He stepped inside, and the door closed behind him. The entire moment lasted less than 20 seconds. No hesitation, no struggle, no audience. Just another ordinary afternoon. I stayed where I was. For months, that same ramp had filled meeting rooms, violation notices, fine letters, and hours of arguments. But to Ethan, it had never been any of those things. It was simply the way he came home. A few minutes later, I walked outside. The neighborhood was almost silent. A lawnmower hummed down the street. 2 children laughed as they rode past on their bicycles, and a neighbor waved while watering flowers. Nobody looked at the ramp. Nobody pointed. Nobody cared. I rested one hand on the railing. For a long time, I believed the story was about proving the board had been wrong. Standing there, I finally understood. It wasn't. The real victory wasn't that the fines disappeared, or that the board changed its procedures, or that people quietly left their positions. The real victory was much simpler. A 12-year-old boy could come home from school every single day without thinking for even a second about how he got inside his own house. I looked toward the front door. Ethan was already laughing at something on television. I smiled to myself, closed the door behind me, and for the first time since we bought that house, there was nothing left to defend. It was simply home.